What if the thing you're most afraid of losing is the very thing that finally teaches you how to listen? This isn't another English lesson with boring grammar rules. It's a true story, my story, about a freezing hospital waiting room, a marriage that almost broke, and the slow, beautiful lesson I learned when life forced me to stop running. If you've ever felt like giving up on love, on language, or on yourself, stay with me. The weight of silence. Imagine sitting on a plastic chair so cold it feels like it was molded from fear itself. Around you, fluorescent lights hum that sickly white glow, the kind that never turns off, never warms up, never blinks. They expose every line of exhaustion on your face, every stray hair, every tiny worry you didn't even know had carved itself into your skin. You glance at the clock. 2:47 a.m. A meaningless number because in this place, time doesn't move the way it's supposed to. It stretches, contracts, like a rubber band pulled too tight, ready to snap. You don't remember how long you've been sitting here. 10 minutes? 10 hours? 10 years? This isn't an airport. It's not a shopping mall or any of those places you've seen in American movies. This is a hospital waiting room, the place where life suddenly pauses to make room for uncertainty. And here's the thing, your brain was never designed to wait for something uncertain. It hates empty spaces so much that it will automatically fill them with the worst possible scenarios. That's an evolutionary glitch. We're wired to prepare for danger, but we forget that tormenting ourselves is its own kind of danger. I was there, on that exact plastic chair, in a small town in Ohio, on a March night when the wind still carried winter's breath. Outside, melting snow had turned into gray puddles under the streetlights. Inside, I was clutching his jacket, an old gray sweatshirt, the kind with pilled fabric at the cuffs. I could still smell it. Morning coffee, garage oil, and a faint trace of our kids after they'd run inside from playing and collapsed into his arms. The scent of ordinary. The thing I never knew I'd have to learn to live without. 3 hours earlier, I'd been tidying the kitchen after dinner. The kids were asleep. He'd said he'd fix the lawnmower in the garage because tomorrow was supposed to be warmer. I heard the garage door close, then the crackle of his old radio playing. And then silence. Not the ordinary quiet of a house late at night. A different silence. A heavy one. The kind you later realize has weight. It presses down on your shoulders, on your chest, and makes you stop breathing before you even know why. I ran to the garage. He was lying on the floor. His face was pale, sweat soaking through his shirt. His lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. In that moment, English, the language I'd spent over a decade learning, writing, perfecting, simply vanished. I could only make sounds, as if my brain had forgotten how to form sentences. You know that feeling? When you're trying to hold everything together and what you need most is language, but language betrays you exactly when you need it. I dialed 911. Thank God I remembered that number. But when the operator asked for my address, I stammered. A woman who'd lived in that house for 7 years, and in panic, I forgot the house number. All I could do was scream into the phone. My husband. He's not breathing. Please hurry. And I cried. I cried like a child who's just learning to speak, words tumbling out in no order. That's how I ended up here. In this waiting room, with shaking hands holding a gray sweatshirt, and one question echoing in my head. Asterisk, what if this is it? What if this is how our story ends? Asterisk. And then, in that heavy silence, something strange happened. My brain, instead of continuing to play out horror scenarios, started to remember. It took me back to a small coffee shop in Seattle, over 10 years ago, where a man with hazel eyes walked up to me and asked, in a slow American voice, "Is this seat taken?" And I answered, with my accent still thick from home, that's a story for later. But right now, look around you. You're in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning. You're waiting for news that could change everything. And in that waiting, you realize something raw. Life isn't built from perfect plans, fluent English, or shiny achievements. It's built from moments you thought were meaningless. Like someone making your coffee every morning. Like a gray sweatshirt that still holds the warmth of the person who wore it. There's a fascinating psychological concept called the paradox of waiting. When you wait for something uncertain, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for emotional regulation, starts to underperform. It's like driving with one hand tied. That's when you feel most out of control. But here's the twist. In that empty space, something else wakes up. Implicit memory. It starts playing back the footage you stored away long ago, as if to remind you that you've lived, you've loved, and you've made it through before. So if you're sitting somewhere in your life right now, not necessarily a hospital waiting room, but some place where everything feels frozen while the world keeps turning, know this. Waiting is an emptiness. It's a room filled with echoes. And sometimes you need those echoes to remember who you are before you can move forward. Because that night, I learned something. Sometimes you don't need more vocabulary or better grammar. You just need one question big enough to make you stop chasing the small stuff and look straight at the only thing that actually matters. And I was still sitting there, holding that gray sweatshirt, waiting for a door to open. The question we avoid. You know that question nobody asks, but everybody carries? The one that sits at the back of your throat during every awkward silence, every job interview that feels like a performance, every first conversation where you're not sure if you're saying the right words. Here it is. What if I never belong here? I carried that question with me on a plane from Ho Chi Minh City to Seattle in the winter of 2014. I was 24 years old, one suitcase, $700 in cash sewn into the lining of my coat, and an English vocabulary that sounded great on paper, but turned to mud the moment a real American spoke to me at full speed. I remember the customs officer at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. He had a thick mustache and a bored face, and he asked me something I didn't catch. I said yes because that seemed safe. He frowned and repeated it. Still didn't understand. I said no. He looked at my visa, then at me, then stamped my passport with a sigh that said another one. That was my welcome to America. Not fireworks. Not the Statue of Liberty. A sigh. Here's what they don't tell you before you move across the world. Loneliness doesn't hit you like a wave. It seeps in, slowly. It starts with small things. You go to a grocery store and spend 10 minutes staring at the yogurt aisle because there are 47 kinds and you don't know which one is just yogurt. You stand in line and the cashier says, "How are you doing today?" And you freeze because you know they don't actually want to know. But you also don't know how to say, "I'm fine. Thanks," without sounding like a robot reading from a textbook. You get home and realize you bought sour cream instead of plain yogurt. You eat it anyway because you're too tired to go back. That was my life for the first year. I worked at a nail salon in a strip mall, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. My hands were raw from acetone and filing. The other workers spoke Vietnamese to me, which was a relief, but also a trap because it meant I wasn't practicing English. I told myself I'd learn later. I told myself I'd have time. I told myself a lot of things while I watched American life happen on the other side of a glass door, like a TV show I couldn't quite tune into. The science of this is brutal. When you're in a new culture and you don't speak the language fluently, your brain is in constant overdrive. Your amygdala, that tiny almond-shaped alarm system in your head, stays activated. It's scanning for threats, for misunderstandings, for moments where you might look stupid. And because it's always on high alert, you get exhausted. Not physically tired, but a deeper exhaustion. The kind that makes you want to cancel plans, avoid phone calls, retreat into the small bubble where you already know how everything works. The problem? That bubble gets smaller and smaller until one day you realize you've been in America for 14 months and you haven't made a single American friend. I remember sitting on my twin bed in my tiny studio apartment, the one with the water-stained ceiling and the radiator that clanked all night, eating instant noodles out of a plastic bowl and asking myself that question, what if I never belong here? I was 25. I had a degree from a good university back home, but here I was a glorified ghost. I existed. I paid taxes. I showed up on time. But nobody knew my name. Nobody knew my story. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure I had a story anymore. I was just surviving. There's a concept in psychology called learned helplessness. It's when you experience repeated failure or stress until you stop trying, even when the situation changes. My brain was flirting with that edge. I stopped going to the free English classes at the library because I was embarrassed to be the oldest person in the room. I stopped saying hello to my neighbors because every attempt felt like a test I'd fail. I stopped hoping because hoping meant risking disappointment. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It's solid. You can't fall through it. And sometimes, when you're sitting there with instant noodles and your own pity, the universe throws you a curveball. For me, that curveball came in the form of a broken espresso machine. One Saturday, I had a rare day off. I wandered into a coffee shop downtown because I'd seen it in a movie, and I wanted to feel like I was in a movie for once. I ordered something I couldn't pronounce, a macchiato, and sat by the window. The machine behind the counter made a horrible screeching sound and then died. The barista, a guy with messy brown hair and a faded band t-shirt, looked at the machine, looked at the growing line of annoyed customers, and then did something I didn't expect. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A real, genuine, this is ridiculous laugh. He said, well, that's not supposed to happen. And people in line started laughing too. I didn't laugh. I watched. And then he looked at me, the only person not in line, and said, you look like you know how to fix things. My English brain short-circuited. I said, what? He said, I'm kidding. But you look like you've seen a ghost. Are you okay? And in that moment, something cracked open. Not because his question was profound, but because it was the first time in over a year that someone had looked at me, really looked, and asked if I was okay. Not how are you? As a greeting. Not can I help you? As a transaction. But are you okay? I didn't have the words. I still had my accent. I still couldn't pronounce macchiato right. But I pointed at the broken machine and said, I fix. In Vietnam, I fix. He raised an eyebrow. You fix espresso machines? No, I said. But I fix. I try. He handed me a screwdriver. And for the next 20 minutes, I took apart that espresso machine with my raw, acetone-scarred hands, while he held a flashlight and asked me questions. Where was I from? How long had I been here? Did I miss home? And I answered in broken English, mixing up tenses, using the wrong prepositions, but he didn't correct me. He just listened. When I finally got the machine running again, a miracle I still don't fully understand, he made me a macchiato and said, you just saved my Saturday. What's your name? I told him. He said, that's beautiful. Can I call you by your name, or do you have an American one? I almost cried right there in that coffee shop, because for a year, I'd been using an American name I'd picked because it was easier for people. But he wanted to know my real name, the one my mother gave me. I said, my name is Mai. He smiled. Nice to meet you, Mai.
I'm David.
And just like that, the bubble cracked. Not burst. Just cracked enough for a little light to get in. I didn't know then that this moment would lead to everything. The marriage, the kids, the house in Ohio, the hospital waiting room. I didn't know that the man with the messy hair and the broken espresso machine would become the reason I finally understood what it meant to be seen. All I knew was that for the first time in 14 months, I wasn't invisible. The question, what if I never belong here, didn't disappear. It stayed. It's still here sometimes on hard days. But something shifted that afternoon. Because I realized belonging isn't a destination. It's not a permanent state you achieve after you've mastered the accent or the grammar or the cultural rules. It's a series of small, unlikely moments. Someone asking your real name. Someone handing you a screwdriver. Someone laughing at a broken machine and inviting you into the chaos with them. So if you're sitting somewhere right now in a new country, a new job, a new chapter, and you're wondering if you'll ever truly belong, here's what I want you to hold on to. You don't have to have perfect English to be seen. You just have to show up, crack open, and let someone hand you a screwdriver. I didn't know it then, but that coffee shop was the first scene of a story I'd spend the next decade living. And the best part? I had no idea how much I'd have to learn. Not just English, but what it really means to listen. A stranger in a strange land. You know that strange space between two people when one of them is still learning the language? It's not empty. It's full. Full of things you want to say, but don't have the words for. Full of things you think you understood, but probably misunderstood. Full of pauses that feel awkward but are actually just your brain working overtime to translate, to filter, to make sure you don't accidentally say something that means the opposite of what you intended. That space is terrifying at first. But later, you realize it's also where the real magic happens. David didn't ask for my number that day at the coffee shop. He asked if I wanted to come back the next Saturday. He said he'd teach me how to make a proper macchiato. I said yes because saying no felt like closing a door I'd just found. And that's how it started. Not with romance, not with grand gestures, but with coffee and broken English and two people trying to figure each other out. The first few Saturdays were pure linguistic chaos. David would show me how to tamp the espresso grounds, how to steam milk until it had that velvety microfoam, and I would nod like I understood, then immediately do it wrong. He never got frustrated. He'd just laugh and say, "Okay, let's try that again." And I'd repeat the motion, repeating the words under my breath. Tamp, steam, pour.
Temps, steam, pour.
My mouth was learning the movements while my hands were learning the same. There's a reason muscle memory and language memory live in the same neighborhood of the brain. When you learn with your whole body, the words stick. But the real learning happened between the instructions. David would ask me questions while we worked. Simple ones at first. What did you study in Vietnam? Do you have brothers or sisters? What's your favorite food? I'd answer in short, jagged sentences. I study business.
But no job.
I have one brother. He lived with my mom. My favorite food is pho. You know pho? He didn't know pho. The next Saturday, he showed up with a printout from a food blog and said, "There's a place 2 blocks away. We should go." For research. That was our first meal together outside the coffee shop. We sat at a small plastic table in a Vietnamese restaurant that smelled like fish sauce and lemongrass. And I watched him struggle with chopsticks and slurp broth too loudly and ask the waiter for more sriracha, even though the bowl was already plenty.
Spicy.
He looked ridiculous. And for some reason, that made me feel safe. Because here was an American who didn't know how to use chopsticks, who couldn't pronounce the names on the menu, who was just as lost as I was in a different way. We were both strangers in a strange land. Just different strange lands. The language barrier created a kind of honesty that I hadn't experienced before. When you don't have the vocabulary to be clever or sarcastic, you're left with simple truths. I couldn't say, I appreciate your patience, and I'm grateful for your friendship. I could only say, you nice. I like talk with you. It felt childish. But David never smiled like it was childish. He smiled like it was enough. And maybe that's the secret that fluent speakers forget. Simple words, said with sincerity, carry more weight than perfect sentences delivered from a distance. We started meeting more often, not just Saturdays. He texts me short, clear messages because he knew I'd struggle with long ones. Coffee after work. Park today, weather good. You okay? That last one became his signature. He asked it often. Not in a worried way, but in a way that said, I see you're carrying something and you don't have to carry it alone. I'd never had someone check on me like that before. In Vietnam, my family loved me, but love there looked like action, cooking meals, paying for school, showing up when things were hard. David's version of love looked like questions, like pausing, like sitting in the space between my broken sentences and waiting. There were misunderstandings, of course. Lots of them. One afternoon, he asked if I wanted to hang out at his apartment. In Vietnamese, the phrase for hang out can also mean something more casual, but my English brain translated it as spend time, and I said yes. When I got there, he had a couch covered in laundry and a half-eaten pizza on the coffee table. He looked embarrassed. I looked confused. We sat on the floor, and he explained that hang out just meant being together without plans. I told him in Vietnam, if you invite someone to your home, you clean first. He said, so I failed the test. I said, yes, but okay. He laughed so hard he spilled his drink. Another time, I tried to tell him that he reminded me of my grandfather. I meant it as a compliment. My grandfather was kind, patient, always fixing things. But in American culture, being compared to someone's grandfather isn't usually a romantic signal. David paused, blinked, and said, am I that old? I panicked and tried to explain, mixing up tenses, accidentally saying, you look like dead person instead of, you remind me of someone who is no longer alive. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, are you trying to tell me I look like a ghost? We both ended up laughing so hard we couldn't breathe. And in that moment, I realized that laughter was its own language. It didn't need perfect grammar. The science behind this is simple but powerful. When we laugh together, our brains release oxytocin, the bonding hormone. It lowers our defenses. It tells our amygdala, that alarm system I mentioned before, to calm down. You can't feel threatened and laugh at the same time. So, every misunderstanding we laughed through was actually a brick in the foundation of trust. We were building something, one ridiculous mistake at a time. 6 months after we met, David asked me if I wanted to be his girlfriend. He didn't say it like that, though. He said, I like you. I want to be with you. But I need to know if you like me too, because sometimes I can't tell if you're just being nice or if you actually, I understood exactly what he meant, because I'd been wondering the same thing. Was he being nice to the immigrant girl who fixed his espresso machine? Or was he choosing me, with my broken English and my raw hands and my constant fear of saying the wrong thing? I looked at him and said, I like you, but I scared. Scared of what? Scared I not enough. My English not good. My life not together. Youth American. You have everything. I have nothing. He reached across the table and took my hands, my rough, acetone-scarred hands, and said, you fix my espresso machine. You showed up every Saturday. You try. That's more than most people do. I don't care about your English. I care about you. I cried. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in my life, someone had looked past the surface and seen the thing I was most ashamed of, my struggle, and called it enough. That moment changed everything. not because David was perfect. He wasn't. He left his laundry everywhere. He forgot birthdays. He had a temper when he was tired. But he had a way of seeing me that made me want to see myself differently too. Slowly, I stopped apologizing for my accent. I stopped shrinking in conversations. I started to believe that maybe I didn't have to be fluent to be worthy of love. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. He did it in the coffee shop where we met, right in front of the espresso machine I'd fixed. He got down on one knee and said, "You taught me that waiting is worth it. Will you wait with me for the rest of our lives?" I said yes before he finished the sentence. Then I cried again.
He was used to it by then.
Looking back, I realized that our love story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a translation project. We were constantly translating, not just words, but intentions, expectations, cultural scripts. In Vietnam, love is often about duty and sacrifice. In America, it's often about choice and self-fulfillment. We had to figure out our own language, somewhere in between. And that took time. It took patience. It took dozens of misunderstandings that we chose to laugh at instead of run from. But the real test of that language, the real test of whether we had actually learned to listen to each other, was still years away. It would come in a hospital waiting room, on a cold March night, when all the simple words in the world wouldn't be enough. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that I had found someone who looked at my broken English and saw not a problem to fix, but a person to love. And that, for a while, felt like enough. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from building something from nothing. It is not the tiredness after a long day of work. It is deeper. It lives in your bones. It is the exhaustion of translating every thought before it leaves your mouth, of calculating every dollar before it leaves your wallet, of measuring every decision against the invisible scale of whether you're doing enough, being enough, becoming enough. That was our first year of marriage. We were two people who had chosen each other across languages, across cultures, across the quiet judgment of people who thought we were moving too fast or too strangely or too far outside the lines of what made sense. David worked at the coffee shop during the day and delivered pizzas at night. I worked at the nail salon 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when someone called in sick. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a garage in a neighborhood where the landlords didn't ask too many questions. The windows rattled when the wind blew. The heater made a sound like a dying animal every time it turned on, but it was ours. And every night, when we came home smelling of coffee or acetone or pizza boxes, we would collapse onto the second-hand couch and just sit there, too tired to talk, too grateful to complain. This is what no one tells you about the American dream. It is not a dream. It is a ladder with missing rungs. You climb and you fall and you climb again, and sometimes you look up and the top has moved further away. But you keep climbing because the alternative is standing still, and standing still in a new country feels like drowning. We had a joint bank account with exactly $482 in it for the first 6 months. I remember that number because I checked it every morning, as if staring at it long enough would make it grow. It didn't. But we didn't starve. We learned the rhythm of survival. We learned that rice and beans could taste different every night if you changed the spices. We learned that free museum days were the best dates. We learned that walking through the city at night, holding hands, cost nothing and felt like everything. My English improved during those years, not because I studied harder, but because I had to use it to survive. David's presence helped in ways I didn't expect. He spoke to me in slow, clear sentences, not because he thought I was stupid, but because he wanted me to understand. And when I didn't understand, he found another way to say it. That is the secret to learning a language that no textbook will tell you. You don't need a teacher. You need someone who is willing to say the same thing 10 different ways until one of them lands. You need someone who doesn't sigh, when you mix up your tenses. You need someone who celebrates when you use a new word correctly, even if you use it in the wrong context. David was that person for me.
He still is.
There is a concept in second language acquisition called comprehensible input. It was developed by a linguist named Stephen Krashen. The idea is simple. You learn a language not by memorizing grammar rules, but by understanding messages that are just slightly above your current level. The language has to be challenging enough to push you forward, but not so challenging that you shut down. David was my comprehensible input. He talked to me about everything. The weather, politics, the plot of a movie he watched, why his coworker was annoying, what he dreamed about last night. And I listened, picking out words I knew, guessing at the ones I didn't, slowly building a map of meaning in my head.
It was slow.
Embarrassingly slow, but it worked. By the time our first child was born, I could hold a conversation without panicking. I still had an accent. I still made mistakes. But I no longer felt like I was wearing a mask every time I opened my mouth. The words were mine now. Imperfect, but mine. Our son was born in the middle of a snowstorm. His name is Min. We chose it because it means bright in Vietnamese. And David said that's what I was to him. The birth was hard. 12 hours of labor, then an emergency C-section. I was terrified. Not of the surgery, but of becoming a mother in a country where my own mother was thousands of miles away. When they placed Min in my arms, I looked at his tiny face, his closed eyes, his perfect fingers curled into fists. And I felt something crack open in my chest.
Not fear this time.
Something else. Something that felt like responsibility, wrapped in wonder, wrapped in the terrifying knowledge that I was now responsible for teaching a small human how to be in the world. David leaned over the hospital bed and said, "You're going to be a great mom." I said, "I don't know how." He said, "You'll learn. We both will." And we did. Slowly. The way you learn anything that matters. By doing it badly at first, then slightly less badly, then one day realizing you've been doing it well for a while without noticing. Min was a difficult baby. He didn't sleep through the night until he was 14 months old. I walked circles around that tiny apartment at 3 in the morning, bouncing him, singing Vietnamese lullabies my mother used to sing to me, whispering words I hoped would sink into his bones. David worked the early shift at the coffee shop, so I took the night shifts alone. I was exhausted. The kind of exhausted where you forget your own phone number, where you put the milk in the cupboard and the cereal in the fridge, where you stare at the wall and realize you've been sitting in the dark for 45 minutes without moving. But there were moments. Small moments that made the exhaustion worth it. Min's first smile. The way he grabbed David's finger and wouldn't let go. The sound of his laugh when we made silly faces. Those moments were like breadcrumbs leading us forward, reminding us why we were doing this. Why we had chosen this life of hard work and little sleep and endless translation between cultures. Our second child, a daughter named Lon, was born 2 years later. She was calmer. She slept. She smiled at strangers. She was the kind of baby that made people say, "Oh, you're so lucky." And we were. But having 2 children under 3 in a 1-bedroom apartment tested us in ways we hadn't anticipated. There was no space. No privacy.
No quiet.
Every argument we had happened in whispers, standing in the bathroom with the fan on so the kids wouldn't hear. And we did argue. About money. About David's long hours. About my mother's expectations that we should send more money home. About whether we should raise the kids speaking Vietnamese, English, or both. About what it meant to be American, and what it meant to be Vietnamese, and what it meant to be both and neither at the same time. One night, after a particularly bad argument about something I can no longer remember, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried. David found me there. He sat down next to me, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "We're going to make it. I don't know how, but we're going to make it." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because we already have. Look at us. We're still here." He was right. We were still there. Still in that tiny apartment above the garage. Still tired. Still broke. Still learning how to be parents, how to be partners, how to be a family that spoke 2 languages and lived in the space between them. But we were there. Together. What I didn't know then was that the hardest test of our togetherness was still ahead. It wouldn't come in the form of money problems or parenting disagreements or cultural misunderstandings. It would come in a form so simple and so devastating that all the English I had learned, all the vocabulary I had collected, all the sentences I had practiced would feel useless again. It would come in the form of a phone call I didn't want to answer, a hospital waiting room, and a question I never thought I'd have to ask myself. But that night, sitting on the bathroom floor with David's hand in mine, I didn't know any of that. I only knew that we had built something together, word by word, dollar by dollar, sleepless night by sleepless night, and that something was worth protecting. The American Dream's unspoken price. There is a moment in every immigrant story that nobody warns you about. It arrives quietly, disguised as success. You have worked for years.
You have saved.
You have sacrificed. And then one day, you look around and realize you have achieved exactly what you came for. A stable job. A house with a yard. Children who speak English without an accent. A life that looks from the outside like the American dream come true. And that is when the strange sadness creeps in. Because you start to wonder what you lost in the process of gaining it all. We moved to Ohio when Min was 4 and Lon was 2. David got a job managing a small chain of coffee roasteries, which meant we could finally leave the apartment above the garage. The house we bought was a small ranch style with a cracked driveway and a maple tree in the front yard that dropped more leaves than any tree had a right to. It was not beautiful by American standards. But to me, it was a palace. Because it had a backyard where the kids could run. Because it had a kitchen big enough for me to cook pho without elbowing the refrigerator. Because it had a front porch where I could sit in the evenings and watch the neighborhood wake up and go to sleep. For the first year in Ohio, I thought we had made it. David's job was steady. The kids were adjusting. I found a Vietnamese grocery store 30 minutes away that sold the right fish sauce and the right noodles and the right kind of rice that stuck to your chopsticks the way it was supposed to. I started working part-time at a community center teaching English to other immigrants. It felt like coming full circle. I was the one who had sat in those chairs, terrified of speaking. Now I was the one standing at the front of the room, saying, "Take your time. You will get there. I believe in you." But here's the thing about the American dream. It is hungry. It always wants more. A bigger house. A better school district. More savings. More security. More proof that you have made it, that you belong. That you are not still the woman who showed up with one suitcase and $700 sewn into her coat. That hunger is quiet at first. It whispers. And if you are not careful, you start listening. David started working longer hours. Not because he had to, but because the company was expanding and he wanted to be the one they promoted. He left before the kids woke up and came home after they went to bed. On weekends, he took calls from the garage, pacing back and forth, his voice tight with stress. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself he was doing this for us. I told myself the same things I had told myself in that nail salon years ago, when I was waiting for my real life to begin. The kids grew. Min started kindergarten. He came home one day and told me he did not want me to speak Vietnamese to him anymore. When I asked why, he said, "Because the other kids said it sounds weird." I felt something crack in my chest. Not anger. Something older. Something that tasted like shame I had thought I'd buried years ago. I said, "But Vietnamese is your language. It is part of you." He said, "I want to be American." And I did not know how to tell him that he could be both. That being Vietnamese was not something to hide. That the sound of his mother's voice in her mother tongue was not weird. It was home. I did not have the words then. My English was good enough to teach a class, but not good enough to explain to a 5-year-old why his identity mattered. So I said nothing. I let him speak English at home. I let him pull away from the language I had sung to him in the dark, the lullabies my mother had sung to me. And every time he said, "Mom, say it in English," I felt myself shrink a little more. Lon was different. She was 3, still young enough to absorb both languages without resistance. She would switch between Vietnamese and English in the same sentence, mixing them up in a way that made me laugh. But even she started to notice. One day at the grocery store, I was talking to her in Vietnamese, and a woman in the checkout line gave me a look. Not hostile, exactly. Curious. The way people look at something they do not understand. Lon tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Mom, talk American." I smiled at the woman and switched to English. And I felt that same crack, that same quiet shame, that same erasure. This is the unspoken price of the American dream. You give up pieces of yourself to fit in. You trade your accent for clarity. You trade your mother tongue for the language of success. You trade your name for something easier to pronounce. And you tell yourself it is worth it because your children will have more opportunities. They will not struggle the way you struggled. They will belong in a way you never will. But belonging has a cost. And the cost is often forgetting who you were before you learn to perform who you are now. The scientific literature on this is heartbreaking. It is called cultural bereavement. It is the grief that comes from losing your cultural identity, not suddenly but slowly over years. Your brain is wired to attach meaning to language, to food, to rituals, to the sounds of home. When those things are stripped away, even by choice, the brain experiences it as a kind of loss. Not dramatic enough to call depression, but persistent. A low hum of sadness that you learn to ignore because you have no time to name it. You are busy. You are succeeding. You are living the dream. So you push it down. I pushed it down for years. I focused on the kids. I focused on my teaching. I focused on being the perfect immigrant success story. I stopped calling my mother as often because the time difference was hard and my English was getting better, and somehow my Vietnamese felt rusty, like a muscle I had not used in too long. I started to feel like a stranger in 2 countries. Too American to be Vietnamese when I went home to visit. Too Vietnamese to be American when I stood in line at the grocery store in Ohio. David did not understand this.
He tried.
He really tried. But how could he? He was born here. His parents were born here. His grandparents too. He had never had to explain why his name was hard to pronounce. He had never had to choose between being understood and being authentic. He saw our life as a success story. A Vietnamese immigrant, a small-town Ohio boy, 2 beautiful kids, a house, a career. What more could anyone want? But I wanted something I could not name. I wanted to feel whole. I wanted to feel like I was not performing for an audience that would never fully accept me. I wanted to speak Vietnamese to my children without them cringing. I wanted to cook the food of my childhood without apologizing for the smell. I wanted to exist in this country without having to prove every single day that I deserved to be here. The arguments started small. David would come home exhausted, and I would be exhausted from the kids, and we would snap at each other over nothing. A dirty dish in the sink. A forgotten appointment. The wrong kind of milk. The fights were not about milk. They were about the distance that had grown between us. The space we had filled with work and parenting, and the relentless effort of maintaining a life neither of us had time to enjoy. One night, After a fight that left me crying in the bathroom again, I looked in the mirror and did not recognize myself. I was 33 years old. I had a husband, 2 children, a house, a career. I had achieved everything I came to America for. And I had never felt more alone. I had built a life word by word, dollar by dollar. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped building it with David. We were living parallel lives under the same roof, passing each other in the hallway like ghosts who had forgotten they were ever real. I did not know then that the universe was about to force us to stop running. I did not know that a phone call was coming that would make all these small arguments, all this quiet distance, feel like the luxury of people who still believed they had time. I did not know that the waiting room was waiting for me. Cracks in the foundation. There is a dangerous kind of numbness that settles into a marriage when both people are too busy to notice they are drifting. It does not arrive with a bang. It does not announce itself with slammed doors or screaming fights. It arrives softly, like dust accumulating on a surface you used to wipe clean every day. One morning you look at the person across the breakfast table and realize you have not had a real conversation in weeks. Not the kind where you look at each other. Not the kind where you remember why you chose each other in the first place. Just logistics. Who is picking up the kids? Who is paying the water bill? Who is cooking dinner because the other person is working late again? That was us by year 7 of our marriage. Year 7. The infamous itch. I used to think that phrase was a joke, something people said to explain why relationships failed. But I learned that the 7-year itch is not about wanting someone new. It is about waking up one day and realizing you have become strangers sharing a house. You know each other's schedules better than you know each other's dreams. You can predict what they will say about the news, about the kids, about the weather. But you have no idea what they are thinking when they stare out the window at night. And somewhere along the way, you stopped asking. David and I had built something beautiful on paper. A home, a family, careers, security. But the foundation had cracks we had stopped noticing because we were too busy decorating the rooms. We had spent years learning each other's languages, but we had forgotten how to listen. Not to words. To the silence underneath them, to the things left unsaid because we were too tired to say them or too afraid of what the answer might be. The cracks showed up in small ways first. David started staying at work later than he needed to, not because there was more work, but because coming home meant more work. The kids needed homework help. I needed help with dinner. The house needed repairs. The dog needed walking. Home had become a list of tasks instead of a place of rest. I noticed. I felt it too. Some evenings, when he finally walked through the door at 8 or 9, I would be too drained to ask about his day. I would hand him a plate of reheated food and disappear into the kids' room to read bedtime stories. We were like 2 ships passing in the night, except the ships were in the same harbor, just refusing to dock. I remember one Thursday evening in particular. It was March, a few weeks before everything changed. The kids were at school. I had the day off. David was supposed to have the day off too. We had talked about it the week before, a rare opportunity to spend time together without the chaos of parenting. I made his favorite breakfast. Vietnamese coffee with condensed milk, the way he learned to drink it from me. I set out 2 cups on the porch. I waited. He came downstairs at 9, already on his phone. There was an issue at one of the coffee shops. A shipment had been delayed. He needed to handle it. He kissed my forehead and said, "Rain check." And he was gone before I could say anything. I sat on the porch alone, drinking both cups of coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up without me. I was not angry. That was the worst part. I was not even angry anymore. I was just used to it. Used to being second. Used to waiting. Used to telling myself that this was temporary, that things would get better when the promotion came, when the kids were older, when we had more money, when. The science of this is both simple and devastating. Psychologists call it the demand withdrawal pattern. One person demands attention, connection, time. The other withdraws, not out of cruelty, but out of overwhelm. And the more the first person demands, the more the second withdraws. And the more the second withdraws, the more the first person feels invisible. It is a loop, a spiral. And once you are in it, getting out feels impossible because every attempt to connect carries the weight of all the previous attempts that failed. I was the demander. David was the withdrawer. I wanted to talk. He wanted to avoid conflict. I wanted to fix things. He wanted to wait for things to get better on their own. We were speaking different languages again, but this time it was not Vietnamese and English. It was the language of hurt and the language of silence. And neither of us was fluent enough to translate. The kids felt it. Children always feel it before adults admit it. Min started acting out at school. His teacher called me to say he was having trouble focusing, that he seemed anxious. Lan, who had always been the easy one, started having nightmares. She would wake up screaming and I would run to her room and hold her while she cried, and she would say, "I dreamed you left," and I would say, "I am not going anywhere," and she would say, "But Daddy left," and I did not know how to explain that Daddy had not left. Not really. He was just in the garage on his phone somewhere else. The night before the accident, David and I had the kind of fight that sits in your throat for days. It was about nothing. A miscommunication about picking up Min from a friend's house. He thought I was getting him. I thought he was. Min had to call me from the friend's phone, confused, waiting on the curb for 45 minutes. By the time I got there, he was trying not to cry. I was furious. Not just at David. At myself. At the system we had created where two people who loved each other could not even coordinate a simple pickup. When David got home, I was waiting in the kitchen.
I said, "We need to talk about this."
He said it was a mistake. I said, "It is not about the mistake. It is about us not being a team anymore."
He sighed. That sigh.
The one that said he was too tired for this conversation, that he had heard it before, that he did not have the energy to fight. He said, "Can we talk about it tomorrow?" I said, "We always say tomorrow. Tomorrow never comes."
He looked at me then.
Really looked. And I saw something in his eyes that I had not seen in a long time. Not anger. Not exhaustion.
Fear.
He said, "What do you want me to say, Mai?" I said, "I want you to see me." He said, "I see you." I said, "No. You see the mother of your children. You see the person who makes dinner and pays the bills. You do not see me." He did not answer. He walked to the garage to fix the lawnmower. That was his escape. Fixing things. Machines that could be repaired with the right tools and enough patience. Unlike us. Unlike the thing between us that had no manual, no replacement parts, no clear path to working again. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of his radio crackling from the garage. I thought about going after him. I thought about saying, "I am sorry, I did not mean it that way." I thought about all the things I could say that would close the distance between us. But I did not. I was too proud. Too tired. Too convinced that I had already done all the reaching I could do. It was his turn. I told myself that as I loaded the dishwasher. I told myself that as I folded the laundry. I told myself that as I checked on the kids one last time before bed. And then the silence came. Not the ordinary quiet of a house at night. The heavy silence. The one with weight. I ran to the garage. He was on the floor. His face was pale. His shirt was wet with sweat. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing me. I screamed his name. He did not answer. I called 911, and the words came out wrong, jumbled, the way they had not come out wrong in years. My English abandoned me again. Because English was the language of my adult life, of my career, of my success. But in that moment, I needed the language of home. The language I had let get rusty. The language I had stopped speaking to my own children. The language of my mother, my grandmother, the women before me who had held dying men in their arms and prayed in words that had no direct translation. I said his name in Vietnamese. I said, "David, please. Please do not leave me." I said all the things I had not said for months. I am sorry. I see you. I need you. Do not go. The ambulance came. The paramedics took him. I followed in our car, driving through streets I did not recognize, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mouth praying in a language I had almost forgotten I still knew. And now I am here, in this waiting room, on this plastic chair, holding his gray sweatshirt, waiting for a door to open. I keep thinking about that last conversation in the kitchen. The words I said. The words I did not say. I thought we had time. I thought tomorrow would come. I thought we would have the conversation eventually, when the kids were older, when work was less crazy, when we were less tired. I thought love was patient.
And it is.
But patience is not the same as waiting forever. Patience is active. It is showing up. It is choosing each other even when it is hard. And I had stopped choosing him.
He had stopped choosing me.
We had stopped choosing us. Now I am choosing. In this waiting room, with nothing but a gray sweatshirt and a prayer in a language I almost lost. I am choosing him. I am choosing us. I am choosing to fight for the thing we built, word by word, dollar by dollar, mistake by mistake. The door has not opened yet, but I am still here, waiting. And maybe that is the only thing that matters right now. That I am here. That I did not leave. That when the silence came, I ran toward it instead of away. The night, everything stopped. Time in a hospital waiting room does not move forward. It folds in on itself. Past and present collapse into the same moment, and you find yourself reliving conversations you thought you had forgotten, hearing words you wish you had never said, seeing faces that should be sleeping peacefully at home but are instead hovering behind your eyelids every time you blink. I sat on that plastic chair, holding David's sweatshirt, and my brain began its cruel work. It showed me everything I had been too busy to notice. Every moment I had let slip by. Every word I had swallowed instead of speaking. I thought about the last real conversation we had before the argument about Min's pickup. The one that mattered. It was 3 weeks before the accident. Lon had a school performance, a little spring concert where the kindergartners sang songs about flowers and sunshine. David promised he would be there. He was late. He walked in during the third song, still in his work clothes, still on his phone, scanning the auditorium for our seats. Lon saw him from the stage. Her face lit up for 1 second, then fell when she saw that he was not looking at her. She finished the song with her eyes on the floor. After the concert, I confronted him in the parking lot. I said, "She saw you. She saw you walk in late, and she saw you on your phone, and she saw that you were not watching her." He said, "I am sorry. I had a call." I said, "You always have a call." He said, "That is not fair." I said, "What is not fair is that our children are learning that they come second to your job." He did not answer. He got in the car and drove home in silence. I sat in the back with the kids, watching his shoulders in the rearview mirror, seeing how tight they were, how tired. And I felt a strange mix of anger and pity. He was not choosing to be absent. He was drowning. And instead of throwing him a rope, I was yelling at him for not swimming faster. That is what the waiting room does. It shows you your own cruelty. It shows you where you were wrong. It shows you the moments when you could have chosen kindness and chose righteousness instead. And there is no escape from it. No phone to scroll. No task to complete.
No distraction.
Just you and the weight of everything you wish you could undo. I thought about our wedding day. It was small. A courthouse ceremony, because we could not afford anything bigger. I wore a white dress I bought on clearance. David wore a suit that was too big in the shoulders because his father had given it to him, and he wanted to wear it even though it did not fit. We said our vows in English and Vietnamese. I said, "I promise to learn your language and your heart." He said, "I promise to listen, even when the words are hard."
We meant it then.
We really meant it. But somewhere along the way, we forgot that promises are not things you make once. They are things you make every day, and we had stopped making them. There is a concept in neuroscience called the negativity bias. Your brain is wired to remember negative experiences more vividly than positive ones. It is a survival mechanism. Your ancestors needed to remember where the tiger was more than they needed to remember where the pretty flowers were. But in a marriage, that bias can be deadly. You remember the fights. You remember the disappointments. You remember the times they let you down. And you forget the small kindnesses, the quiet moments, the ways they showed up when you were not looking. Your brain builds a case against the person you love, and you start to believe the case is the whole truth. Sitting in that waiting room, my brain tried to build that case. It showed me every time David forgot something, every time he was late, every time he chose work over us. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the fear. Maybe it was the silence of that room finally cracking something open in me. The case started to fall apart. And in its place, the other memories came flooding in. The ones I had buried under the resentment. The ones I had let the negativity bias erase. I remembered the way David learned to make pho for me when I was pregnant with Min and could not stop craving it. He watched YouTube videos for hours. He drove 45 minutes to the Asian grocery store and came back with the wrong noodles 3 times before he got it right. The pho he made was not perfect. The broth was too dark. The spices were uneven. But he stood in that tiny kitchen above the garage for 6 hours, stirring, tasting, adjusting, and when he brought me the bowl, he said, "It is not as good as your mother's, but I will keep trying until it is." I cried, not because of the pho, because he was trying.
He was always trying.
And I had stopped seeing it. I remembered the way he held Lon when she was born. She was so small, so fragile, and he was terrified of holding her wrong. He sat in the hospital chair with her against his chest, not moving for hours, just looking at her face like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. He said, "I am going to be the best dad I can be." And he was. He coached Min's soccer team, even though he knew nothing about soccer. He read bedtime stories in voices so ridiculous that the kids would laugh until they could not breathe. He took Lon to dance class every Saturday morning, sitting in the waiting room with the other parents, learning the names of all the other kids. Being present in a way I had stopped giving him credit for. I remembered the night we found out we were approved for the house in Ohio. We were still in that apartment above the garage, and David came home with a bottle of sparkling cider, because we could not afford champagne. He poured 2 plastic cups and said to us, "To the family we are building." We drank and he pulled me close and we danced in the living room to no music, just swaying, and he said, "One day we're going to look back at this and laugh. We're going to say, remember when we lived above a garage? Remember when we had nothing?" And I said, "We have everything." He kissed my forehead and said, "Yes, we do." How did I forget that? How did I let the small disappointments pile up so high that they buried the foundation of who we were? How did I let the noise of daily life drown out the sound of his voice saying my name, saying our children's names, saying I love you in 1,000 small ways I had stopped noticing? The waiting room does not let you hide from these questions. It sits with you. It forces you to look at yourself, really look, and see the ways you contributed to the distance, the cracks, the silence. And it asks you one question, over and over, until you cannot avoid it anymore. If he walks through that door, if he opens his eyes, if he comes back to you, what will you do differently? I held his sweatshirt tighter. I could smell him on it. That familiar mix of coffee and garage, and something that was just him. I closed my eyes, and I made a promise. Not the kind you make once and forget. The kind you make in the dark, when there is nothing left to lose, when the only thing that matters is the truth. I promised that if he came back, I would see him. Really see him. Not the version of him I had built in my head, the one who was always failing me. But the real him. The one who learned to make faux. The one who held our daughter like she was made of glass. The one who danced with me in an apartment above a garage with nothing but sparkling cider and a dream. I promised that I would stop counting the ways he fell short and start counting the ways he showed up. I promised that I would speak the hard words instead of swallowing them. I promised that I would listen to the silence underneath the words and ask what it was trying to say. I promised that I would choose him, not because he was perfect, but because he was mine, and I was his, and we had built something worth fighting for. The clock on the wall said 4:12 a.m. I had been sitting there for over an hour. It felt like a lifetime. I looked at the door to the emergency unit. It had not opened, but I was still there, still waiting, still holding his sweatshirt, still holding the promise I had made in the dark. And then I heard footsteps. Not the soft shuffle of nurses making rounds. Something else. Something that made my heart stop. The door was opening. Memories like a flood. The door opened, and a doctor walked out. She was young, maybe early 30s, with dark circles under her eyes that matched my own. She held a clipboard, and she was looking at it, not at me, and in that moment I learned something about time. It does not slow down when you are waiting. It speeds up. Every second between her walking through that door and her reaching me contained an eternity. I saw her mouth form words, but I could not hear them. The blood was rushing too loudly in my ears. I stood up. The sweatshirt fell to the floor. I did not pick it up. She said my name.
Meh.
I nodded. She said, "Your husband is stable. He is out of surgery. He is going to be okay." I do not remember falling. But I must have, because the next thing I knew there was a nurse on one side of me and the doctor on the other. And they were helping me back into the plastic chair. The doctor was saying something about a blocked artery, about how fast the paramedics got there, about how lucky we were. But I was not hearing the words. I was hearing the sound of my own breath coming back. I was feeling my heart slow down from the sprint it had been running for the last hour. I was crying. Not the quiet tears I had been crying before. The loud kind. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep you forget it was there.
He was going to be okay. He was going to be okay.
I said it over and over, like a prayer, like a song I was learning the words to. He was going to be okay. The doctor said I could see him in a few minutes, once he was settled in the recovery unit. She said he was still groggy from the anesthesia, but he was awake. He had been asking for me. That was what she said. He had been asking for me. Not his phone. Not his work. Not the kids.
Me.
In the haze between surgery and waking, his first thought had been my name. I sat in that chair for what felt like 5 more hours but was probably only 10 minutes. And in those 10 minutes, the memories I had been holding back broke through like water through a dam. Not the hard memories this time. The soft ones. The ones I had wrapped in tissue paper and stored in the back of my mind, too precious to take out, too fragile to examine. They came flooding forward now, demanding to be seen. I remembered the first time David told me he loved me. It was 6 months into our friendship, before we were officially dating. We were sitting on the steps of his apartment building, sharing a container of takeout pho that I had taught him to order correctly. He said, I have been trying to figure out how to say this in Vietnamese. I laughed and said, you cannot say it in Vietnamese. He said, I know. That is why I have to say it in English. He looked at me and said, I love you. And then he said it again, slower, as if I might not have understood the first time. I understood. I said it back. And then we sat there, two people who had just said the biggest words in the smallest language we shared, and we ate cold noodles and watched the city lights, and I felt, for the first time since leaving home, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I remembered our first big fight. It was about money. We were so broke that month that we had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. David wanted to pay the bill. I wanted to buy food. We yelled at each other in the kitchen, two people who had never learned to fight in the same language. So we were probably yelling about different things entirely. I said something cruel. I do not remember what, but I remember the look on his face. Not anger, hurt. He walked out of the apartment and did not come back for 2 hours. When he came back, he had groceries. He had used his credit card, the one he was trying to pay off, and he had bought rice and eggs and vegetables. He said, I am sorry. I said, I am sorry too. We ate dinner in silence. And then he reached across the table and took my hand. We did not talk about the fight again. But we started checking in with each other about money differently. We started saying, I am scared, instead of, you are spending too much. We started learning how to be on the same side of a problem instead of opposite sides of an argument. I remembered the day Min was born. David was in the delivery room, holding my hand, looking paler than I was. When the doctor said, it is a boy, David started crying. Not a few tears. Full crying. He said, we made a person. We made a whole person. And then he looked at me and said, you are the strongest person I have ever met. I was too exhausted to respond. But I remember thinking, no, we are the strongest. Because we had made it. We had taken 2 broken languages and 2 different worlds, and we had built a new one together. And now there was a tiny person who would carry both of us inside him forever. I remembered the way David looked at Lon when she was first placed in his arms. He had been nervous about having a daughter. He said, what if I mess her up? What if I do not know how to be a father to a girl? I told him, you just love her. That is all you have to do.
And he did.
From the moment he held her, he loved her in a way that was quiet and fierce and constant. He learned to braid hair from YouTube tutorials. He took her to get ice cream after every dance class. He told her she was brave and smart and kind, not just pretty, because he wanted her to know her worth went deeper than her face. He was the father I had always wanted for my children, and I had forgotten to tell him that. I remember the last time I saw my mother before I left Vietnam. She stood at the airport gate, and she did not cry. She was not a crier. She said, you're going to a country where you do not know the language. You are going to be alone. You're going to be scared. But you are my daughter. You will figure it out. And then she hugged me so tight I could feel her heartbeat against my chest. She said, find someone who sees you. Not who you are pretending to be. Who you really are. And do not let them go. I found him. I found David. And somewhere along the way, I had started letting him go. Not on purpose. Not all at once. But slowly, day by day, moment by moment, I had stopped seeing him the way my mother had taught me to be seen. I had stopped telling him he was enough. I had stopped saying the things that mattered because I was too busy saying the things that did not. The nurse came back and said I could see him now. I walked down the hallway on legs that did not feel like my own. The lights were dim. The machines beeped in rhythms I did not understand. And then I saw him. He was lying in a hospital bed, pale against the white sheets, tubes in his arms, monitors blinking above his head. His eyes were closed. For a terrible second, I thought I had lost him again. But then he opened his eyes. He looked at me, and he smiled. Not a big smile. He was too tired for that. But a small one. The kind of smile that said, I knew you would be here. I walked to the side of the bed and took his hand. His hand that had learned to make faux. His hand that had held our children. His hand that had held mine through poverty and panic and the slow erosion of a marriage we both thought was failing. I held it, and I did not let go.
He said, hey.
His voice was a whisper, hoarse from the tube they had taken out. He said, you are here. I said, I am here. He said, I am sorry. I said, do not be sorry.
Just stay. He squeezed my hand. It was weak.
But it was there. He said, I had a dream. While I was out. I dreamed you were sitting in a waiting room. And you were waiting for me. I laughed. I could not help it. I said, that was not a dream. That was real. He said, I know. That is why I came back. I leaned down and pressed my forehead against his. His skin was warm. He was alive. He was alive, and he was here, and I was holding his hand, and we were not in a waiting room anymore. We were in a room with machines and fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic, but we were together. And that was the only thing that mattered. I said, I have something to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. He said, what? I said, I see you. I see all of you. And you are enough. You have always been enough. He closed his eyes. A tear slid down his cheek. He said, I see you too, I always have. I stayed there, holding his hand, watching him breathe, watching the machines blink, watching the night outside the windows slowly turn into morning. The waiting was over, but the real work was just beginning. Learning to listen again. They tell you that surviving a heart attack is a second chance. What they do not tell you is that a second chance is not a clean slate. It is not a reset button that erases everything that came before. A second chance is a room you walk into with all your old furniture, all your old habits, all your old patterns, and you have to decide, in the quiet of that room, what you are going to keep and what you are finally going to let go. David came home from the hospital 5 days after the surgery. The kids had decorated the front door with a sign that said, Welcome home, Daddy, in wobbly letters. Lon had drawn a picture of our family holding hands under a rainbow. Min had written a list of things he wanted to do with his dad when he got better.
Ride bikes.
Play catch. Watch a movie without falling asleep. The list was long. The list made me cry. The first week was easy in the way that crises are easy. Everyone is on high alert. Everyone is gentle. Everyone remembers to be kind because the alternative is too terrible to imagine. I cooked everything David was allowed to eat, which was not much. Low sodium. Low fat.
No sugar.
He ate it without complaint, which was not like him.
He was a complainer about food.
He always had been. But now he ate my bland rice porridge and steamed vegetables and said, this is good.
Thank you.
I knew it was not good. I knew he was being careful. We were both being careful, walking around each other like the floor might crack if we stepped too hard. The hard part started in week 2. The adrenaline faded. The relief faded. And we were left with each other, in our house, with all the same problems we had before the heart attack, plus a new one. David was afraid. Not of dying. He was afraid of being useless. He had always been the fixer, the doer, the one who stayed late at work and fixed the lawnmower and carried the heavy boxes and made the plans. Now he could not lift anything heavier than a gallon of milk. He could not drive. He could not go back to work. He sat on the couch and watched the world move without him, and I watched him shrink. The kids did not understand. Min asked why Dad was always sleeping. Lon asked why Dad did not play with her anymore. I tried to explain. I said, Daddy is healing.
His body needs rest.
But what I could not explain was that David was not just healing his body. He was healing something deeper. Something that had been broken long before the heart attack. Something neither of us had the words for. I started paying attention in a way I had not before. Not to what he was saying.
To what he was not saying.
The way he stared out the window in the afternoons. The way his hands rested on his lap. Still, not fixing anything. The way he said, "I am fine," when I asked how he was feeling, and the way his jaw tightened when he said it. I had heard those words 1,000 times before. I am fine. I had accepted them. I had moved on. But now, sitting in the silence of our living room with the weight of what I almost lost pressing against my chest, I heard something else underneath them. I heard, "I am scared." I heard, "I do not know who I am anymore." I heard, "I need you to stay." There is a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is passive. It is the sound waves hitting your eardrums, the brain processing the syllables, the acknowledgement that someone has spoken. Listening is active. It is leaning in. It is asking, "What do you mean by that?" It is sitting in the silence after the words end and waiting for the real message to surface. I had spent years hearing David. I had spent the last week hearing him. But in that moment on the couch, watching him watch the window, I decided to listen. I said, "Tell me what you were thinking."
He said, "Nothing."
I said, "That is not true."
"Tell me."
He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I do not know what I am supposed to do now. I have been working my whole life.
It is all I know.
If I cannot work, who am I?" I said, "You are David. You are a father. You are a husband. You are the man who learned to make pho for his pregnant wife. You are the man who coached soccer even though he did not know the rules. You are the man who braids our daughter's hair. You are more than your job." He did not answer. But he did not say, "I am fine," either. He sat with what I said. And I sat with him. That was the first time in a very long time that we had a real conversation. Not about logistics. Not about the kids. Not about the house. About us. About what was underneath the surface of our days. The science of listening is surprisingly simple. When someone feels heard, their brain releases oxytocin, the same bonding hormone that floods a mother's body when she holds her newborn. Feeling heard is not just emotionally comforting. It is biologically calming. It lowers cortisol, the stress hormone. It slows the heart rate. It tells the amygdala, the alarm system, that it can stand down. All these years, I had been trying to fix David with words, with arguments, with demands. What he needed was not a fixer. He needed someone to sit with him in the mess and say, "I am here. I am not going anywhere." I started sitting with him every afternoon, not doing anything, just sitting. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we watched the maple tree in the front yard lose its leaves. Sometimes he slept, and I read a book beside him, my hand on his arm, feeling his pulse, steady now, proof that he was still there. The kids learned to join us. Lon would climb onto the couch and rest her head on David's lap. Min would sit on the floor with his homework, close enough to reach out and touch his father's hand if he wanted to. We were learning to be together again. Not the rushed togetherness of schedules and carpools and homework and dinner. The quiet togetherness. The kind that does not need to be productive or impressive. The kind that just is. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after he came home, David turned to me and said, "I have been thinking about something." I said, "What?" He said, "When I was in the hospital, I kept thinking about that coffee shop. The one where we met. Do you remember?" I said, "Of course I remember." He said, "I have been thinking that maybe I should go back. Not to work. Just to sit. To remember who I was before I forgot." I smiled. I said, "I will go with you." We drove to Seattle that weekend. Not in a hurry. We took the slow roads. David drove because he was finally allowed to. And I sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape change from Ohio flatness to the green hills of the Pacific Northwest. We did not talk much.
We did not need to.
The silence between us was different now. It was not the silence of two people who had run out of things to say. It was the silence of two people who had learned that some things do not need to be said to be understood. The coffee shop was still there. Different owners. Different menu. But the same counter, the same window. The same afternoon light that had fallen across my hands as I fixed that broken espresso machine 12 years ago. We sat at the table by the window and ordered 2 macchiatos. David looked around and said, "This is where I saw you for the first time. You were sitting right there, looking like you had just survived something terrible." I said I had. He said, "I know. That is why I talked to you. You looked like someone who needed to be seen." I took his hand across the table. I said, "I still need to be seen." He said, "I know. I am learning to see again." We stayed until the light changed. Until the afternoon turned to evening and the streetlights came on and the coffee shop filled with people who had no idea they were sitting in the middle of someone's second chance. And when we walked out, David held the door for me, and we walked to the car. And I leaned into his shoulder the way I had when we were young and broke and too in love to know what we were doing. He was not the same. I was not the same. But we were here. And that was enough. The slowest, most beautiful lesson. Recovery is not a straight line. It is a spiral. You think you are moving forward, and then one morning you wake up and you are back where you started, facing the same fears, the same doubts, the same questions you thought you had already answered. David had good days and bad days. On good days, he walked around the block with me and talked about the future. He said he wanted to teach Min how to change a tire. He wanted to take Lon to the ocean because she had never seen it. He wanted to learn Vietnamese, actually learn it this time, not just the phrases I had taught him for ordering pho. On bad days, he sat in his chair and stared at the wall and said nothing. On bad days, I sat with him. That was all I could do. That was all he needed. The doctors said the recovery would take months. They said his heart had been damaged, not destroyed, but damaged enough that he would have to change his life. No more 12-hour days. No more stress. No more ignoring the signals his body had been sending him for years. They gave him a list of things he could not do anymore, and he looked at that list like it was a death sentence. I watched his face as he read it, and I saw something I had not seen before. I saw a man who had spent his whole life running, finally being told to stand still. And I saw that he did not know how. I learned things about David during those months that I had never known. Small things. Things I had been too busy to notice. He hummed when he was concentrating. He always hummed the same song, some old country tune his grandfather used to sing. I had heard it 1,000 times without really hearing it. Now I listened. I learned that he had a specific way of folding towels, a triangle fold that he learned in college, and that he could not stand it when I folded them differently. I had been folding towels wrong for 12 years, and he had never said a word. When I asked him why, he said, "Because it did not matter." I said, "Then why does it matter now?" He said, "Because now I have time to notice." That was the gift of the waiting room.
Time.
Not the rushed time of before, the time that was always running out, the time that made us snap at each other and forget to say, "I love you." The slow time. The time that stretches when you let it, the time that lets you see the person next to you not as a collection of habits that annoy you, but as a whole world you have been living beside without ever really entering. I started teaching David Vietnamese again. Not the formal lessons I had tried before, the ones that ended in frustration because he could not get the tones right. I taught him the way I had learned English.
Slowly.
In moments. I pointed at things and said the Vietnamese word.
Door.
Window.
Tree.
He repeated them, badly, and I did not correct him. I just said them again, later, when he was not expecting it. His brain was learning the way all brains learn best. Through repetition. Through safety. Through the absence of judgment. One day, he pointed at the maple tree in the front yard and said, "K."
Tree.
I almost cried. He had learned one word. One word in 12 years of marriage. But he had learned it because I finally stopped trying to teach and started letting him listen. The kids watched us. They watched the way we sat together on the couch, the way I held his hand when we walked, the way he looked at me across the dinner table like he was seeing me for the first time. Min asked me one night, "Are you and Dad okay now?" I said, "Yes, we are learning to be okay." He said, "Did you stop fighting?" I said, "We stopped fighting about things that do not matter." He thought about that for a minute and then he said, "Good, because I did not like it when you fought." I pulled him close and said, "I did not like it either. I am sorry." He said, "It is okay. You are learning too." Out of the mouths of children. The truth we spend our whole lives running from, and a 9-year-old can say it in 3 words. You are learning too. Lon was 6. She did not understand the complexity of what had happened. She only understood that her daddy was home now and that he was slow, and that sometimes he was sad. She handled this by climbing onto his lap and telling him long, rambling stories about her day, about the girl who was mean to her at recess, about the butterfly she saw on the way to school, about the dream she had where she could fly. David listened. He listened to every word. And I watched him, and I realized that he was learning the same thing I was learning. That listening is not a passive act. It is a gift. It is saying, your words matter. You matter. There is a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. It is the idea that people who go through terrible things do not always come out broken. Sometimes they come out stronger. Not because the trauma was good for them. Trauma is never good. But because surviving it forces them to reevaluate what matters. To let go of the things that were not serving them. To hold on tighter to the things that are. David and I were in the middle of post-traumatic growth. We did not know if we would come out stronger, but we knew we were coming out different. And different, we decided, was enough. One evening, about 2 months after the heart attack, David asked me to sit with him on the porch. It was spring now. The maple tree was putting out new leaves. The air smelled like cut grass and rain. He said, "I have been thinking about what you said. In the hospital. About seeing me." He said, "I realized something. I have not been seeing myself either. I have been so busy being the person everyone needed me to be that I forgot who I was underneath all of it." He said, "I am scared." I said, "Of what?" He said, "Of finding out that underneath all of it, there is nothing. Just a guy who works too hard and does not know how to be anything else." I took his hand. I said, "There is more. There has always been more. You just forgot." He said, "Help me remember." So I did. I told him about the things I had seen in him over the years. The way he held Lon when she was born. The way he stayed up all night with Min when he had the flu, not sleeping, just sitting beside his bed in case he needed anything. The way he looked at me on our wedding day, like I was the only person in the world. I told him about the foe, about the dancing in the apartment, about the way he hummed when he was concentrating, and how I had learned to love that song without even knowing it. He listened. He did not cry, but his hand tightened around mine. He said, "I want to learn your language. Not just the words, the real language. The one you speak when you are dreaming." I said, "That language takes time." He said, "We have time. We have all the time in the world." We started a new rhythm. Mornings were slow. Coffee on the porch. Watching the neighborhood wake up. I would teach him a Vietnamese word. He would teach me an English word I did not know, something obscure, something from a book he was reading. Our vocabulary grew together. Afternoons were for the kids. We played board games and walked to the park and let Lon teach us how to do cartwheels on the grass. Evenings were quiet. Dinner together, no phones, no screens, just the four of us around the table, talking about our days, listening to each other in a way we had forgotten how. The cracks in our foundation were still there. They did not disappear just because we had survived something terrible, but we were not ignoring them anymore. We were looking at them, together, and deciding which ones needed to be filled and which ones were just part of the architecture of a life that had been lived honestly. We had built something beautiful, but it had cracks. And that was okay. Cracks let the light in. One night, after the kids were asleep, David and I sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. He said, "Do you remember that night in the waiting room?" I said, "I will never forget it." He said, "I was not there, but I felt you. I felt you waiting."
I said, "How?"
He said, "I do not know. I just knew. I knew you were there, and I knew I had to come back." I leaned my head on his shoulder.
He put his arm around me.
We sat like that, two people who had almost lost everything learning to hold on again. The slowest, most beautiful lesson of all. That love is not a feeling. It is a choice. A choice you make every day. In the waiting. In the listening. In the sitting beside someone when they cannot sit beside themselves. We were not the same people who had walked into that waiting room. We were different. Scared, maybe. Wiser, maybe. But different. And different, we decided, was a good place to start. Building something new. There is a myth about second chances. The myth says that once you survive something terrible, everything after that is easy. You have learned your lesson. You've been given a gift. And now you get to live the rest of your life in a state of constant gratitude, never fighting, never forgetting, never falling back into the old patterns that almost destroyed you. That myth is beautiful. It is also wrong. The truth is that old patterns are comfortable. They are like worn shoes. You know exactly where they pinch and where they give. And when you are tired, when you are scared, when the world presses in on you in ways you did not expect, your feet will reach for those old shoes every time. The work of a second chance is not the work of surviving the crisis. It is the work of choosing every day not to put on the old shoes. David, and I learned this the hard way. 6 months after the heart attack, he was clear to go back to work.
Part-time.
The doctors said no more than 20 hours a week. They said no stress. They said listen to your body. David heard what he wanted to hear. He heard, you can go back. He heard, everything is fine now. He heard, you do not have to be scared anymore. He started with 15 hours a week. Then 20. Then 25. He said it was temporary. He said there was a project that needed his attention. He said he would slow down after the project was done. I heard the old words. The words I had heard for years before the heart attack. And I felt the old fear rising in my chest. I did not say anything at first. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself he knew his limits now. I told myself that the old patterns were behind us, that we had learned, that we were different. But one night, he came home at 8 o'clock instead of 5. He was pale. He was tired. He said he had a headache. And I snapped. I did not mean to. The words came out before I could stop them. I said, "You're doing it again." He said, "Doing what?" I said, "Killing yourself."
Slowly.
1 hour at a time. He stared at me. His face went from tired to defensive. He said, "I am working part-time." I said, "You're working more than part-time. You are lying to yourself." He said, "I am not lying. I am just trying to do my job." I said, "Your job almost killed you." He said, "Do not say that." I said, "It is the truth. And you are pretending it is not." The fight was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was quiet and sharp, and it cut both of us. He said, "You do not trust me." I said, "I trust you." "I do not trust the old patterns." He said, "I am not the old patterns." I said, "You are wearing them like a coat you forgot to take off." He did not answer. He walked to the garage. Not to work. To sit. That was his new escape. Not fixing things. Just sitting in the silence of the garage. The same silence that had been there the night of the heart attack. I stood in the kitchen, and I felt the old fear, and the old anger, and the old helplessness all at once. And then I did something I had not done before. I did not wait. I did not let him disappear into the garage alone. I walked out there. I sat down beside him on the floor, the same floor where I had found him 6 months ago, and I did not say anything. He said, "I am scared." I said, "I know." He said, "I am scared that if I stop working, I will disappear. I am scared that I do not know who I am without it." I said, "I know." He said, "I am scared that you will see who I really am and you will not like it." I said, "I already see who you really are. And I like it." He looked at me. His eyes were wet. He said, "I do not want to go back to the way things were." I said, "Then do not." He said, "How?" I said, "One choice at a time. That is all it is. One choice. Every day. You choose us. Or you choose the old patterns. There is no middle. There is no temporary. There is just what you choose." We sat in the garage for a long time. The floor was cold. The air smelled like motor oil and old cardboard. But we were there together. And that was the difference. The old me would have let him go. Would have let him sit alone. Would have let the silence grow between us. Would have waited for him to come back on his own. The new me sat down on the cold floor and stayed. Because I had learned something in the waiting room. Something I could not unlearn. You do not wait for the people you love to figure it out on their own. You sit beside them in the dark and you figure out together. David cut his hours back to 15 a week. He started seeing a therapist. He said he needed to talk to someone who was not me. Someone who could help him untangle the knot of who he thought he was supposed to be from who he actually was. I was glad. I was learning my own lessons too. I started going to a support group for caregivers. People who had watched someone they love almost die and were now trying to figure out how to live with the aftermath. The group was full of people who looked like me. Tired. Scared. Pretending to be okay. We sat in a circle in a church basement and told our stories. Some of them were worse than mine. Some of them were easier. But all of them were about the same thing. The fear of losing someone. The fear of losing yourself in the process of keeping them alive. One woman in the group said something that stayed with me. She said, "I used to think that loving someone meant protecting them from everything. Now I think it means letting them be scared and staying anyway." I thought about that. I had spent so many years protecting David. From my feelings. From my disappointment. From the truth of what I needed from him. I had swallowed my words and smoothed things over and pretended I was fine when I was not. And in protecting him, I had pushed him away. Because love that does not tell the truth is not love. It is a performance. And performances are exhausting for everyone. I started telling the truth. Not the sharp truth of a fight. The quiet truth. The truth that sits in your chest and waits for you to be brave enough to say it. I told David, "I am scared too." I told him, "I need you to slow down because I cannot lose you again." I told him, "I miss you when you are in the garage." I told him, "I am learning too. I am learning to stop pretending I am fine when I am not." He listened. He did not fix anything. He just listened. And that was enough. The kids grew. They grew into the new rhythm of our family. Min started middle school. He was quiet and serious, like his father, and he watched us the way children watch their parents, absorbing the lessons we did not know we were teaching. One day he came home from school and said, "My friend asked me why my dad does not work full-time. I told him my dad is learning to take care of himself." David heard that. I saw his face change. He said, "What did your friend say?" Min said, "He said that was cool." David smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. Lon was in second grade now. She was still the one who climbed onto laps and told long stories. But she was different too. More careful. More watchful. She had learned something about fear that no 6-year-old should have to learn. But she had also learned something about love. She saw us sitting together on the porch. She saw David holding my hand. She saw the way we looked at each other now. Not the distracted look of before, but the look of two people who had almost lost everything and had decided, together, to keep it.
She saw that,
and she grew up inside that seeing. One evening after dinner, we were sitting in the living room. David was on the couch. I was beside him. Min was on the floor with his homework. Lon was drawing at the coffee table. It was ordinary. It was nothing special. And then Lon looked up from her drawing and said, "I like it when everyone is home." David said, "Me too." Min said, without looking up from his math, "This is nice." I looked around the room. At my husband, who had almost died. At my children, who had almost lost their father. At the house we had built, the life we had made, the cracks we were still learning to fill. And I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter. Something steadier. Something that felt like peace. I looked at David. He was looking at the kids. His face was soft. The tension that had lived in his jaw for years was gone. He looked like the man I had met in the coffee shop. Not younger. Not unchanged. But present. Fully present in a way he had not been in years. He felt me looking and turned. He smiled. He said, "What?" I said, "Nothing. Just looking." He said, "At what?" I said, "At what we built." He reached over and took my hand. His hand was warm.
His pulse was steady.
He said, "We are not done building."
I said, "I know."
He said, "That is okay." I said, "I know." He squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. And we sat there, in our ordinary living room, on an ordinary evening, and we let ourselves be ordinary. No drama.
No crisis.
No waiting room. Just us. Just now. Just the slow, quiet work of building something that might last. What matters now? It has been 3 years since the waiting room. 3 years since I sat on that plastic chair holding David's sweatshirt, convinced that my life was about to end in a fluorescent-lit hallway in Ohio. 3 years since I learned that waiting is not empty. It is the space where everything you thought you knew gets stripped away, and you are left with the raw, terrifying, beautiful question of what you will keep. I think about that question often now. Not in the panicked way I thought about it in the waiting room, but in the quiet way. The way you think about something that has become part of you, like a scar that is healed but still reminds you, every time you touch it, that you survived. David is sitting across from me at the kitchen table. He is reading the newspaper. Actual paper. He started reading the paper again after the heart attack. He said screens made his eyes tired, but I think it was something else. I think he wanted to slow down, to hold something that could not buzz or ring or demand his attention. He turns the page slowly. He sips his coffee. Vietnamese coffee. Condensed milk at the bottom. I taught him how to make it years ago, and now he makes it better than I do. He looks up and catches me watching him. He smiles. He says, "What?" I say, "Nothing." He says, "You're doing that thing again." I say, "What thing?" He says, looking at me like I am going to disappear. I say, "I am not looking at you like that." He says, "You are. It is okay. I look at you the same way." He is not wrong. I do look at him like he might disappear. because for a few hours on a March night he did. He was not here. He was somewhere else, somewhere I could not follow. And I was sitting in a waiting room learning that the ground under my feet was not as solid as I thought. That lesson does not leave you. It softens. It becomes something you carry instead of something that carries you. But it does not leave. The kids are at school. Min is 12 now. He is taller than me. He has David's eyes and my stubbornness, which makes for interesting conversations. He asked me last week if I was happy.
I said yes.
He said, "Are you happy with Dad?" I said yes. He said, "Good." Because I was worried for a while. I said, "I know. I was worried too." He nodded and went back to his homework, satisfied. 12 years old, and already checking on his parents' marriage. That is what happens when your family goes through something hard. The children grow up faster. Not in the sad way. In the way that makes them wise before they should be. Min is wise. He is also still a boy. He leaves his shoes in the middle of the hallway and forgets to do his chores and spends too much time on his video games. I love those things about him. The ordinary things. The things that mean he is safe enough to be a kid. Lon is 9. She is the one who still climbs onto laps, though she is getting too big for it. She climbs onto David's lap every evening and tells him about her day. The stories are shorter now. She is learning that not everything needs to be a story. Some things are just the shape of a day. The way the sun fell through the classroom window. The sound of the rain on the roof during reading time. The way her friend laughed at a joke she told. She tells David these things and he listens. He puts down his paper. He puts down his phone. He listens. That is what he learned in the waiting room too. That listening is not passive. It is the most active thing you can do. It is saying, "I am here. I am not going anywhere. Your words matter." I think about my mother sometimes. She passed away 2 years ago. I was able to go back to Vietnam for the funeral. David came with me. He stood beside me at the grave and held my hand and did not try to fix anything. He just stood there. When I cried, he cried too. When I spoke Vietnamese to my relatives, he did not understand, but he stayed. He stayed beside me the way I had stayed beside him in the waiting room. That is what we learned. Not how to fix each other. How to stay. My mother's last words to me were in Vietnamese.
She said, "Con đã tìm thấy người nhìn thấy con."
You found someone who sees you. She was right. I did. And I almost let him go. Not because I stopped loving him. Because I forgot that love is not a feeling you have.
It is a choice you make.
Every day. In the small moments. In the ordinary moments. In the moments when you are tired and scared and you want to run.
You choose to stay. You choose to see.
You choose to listen. David and I are not the same people who walked into that waiting room. We are different. We are slower. We are quieter. We are more careful with each other. Some people might look at us and think we are boring. We do not go out much. We do not have the same friends we used to. We spend our evenings on the porch, watching the maple tree lose its leaves and grow them back. We spend our weekends at the park with the kids, or in the kitchen cooking together, or just sitting in the living room with books and the comfortable silence of two people who have nothing to prove to each other. It is not the life I imagined when I came to America with one suitcase and $700. It is better, because it is real, because it is ours. There is a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. It is not about being grateful for the terrible thing that happened. It is about recognizing that surviving it changed you, and that some of those changes are worth keeping. I kept the change. David kept the change. We kept the slow mornings and the Vietnamese lessons and the way we hold hands on the porch. We kept the honesty, the willingness to say, "I am scared. I am not okay. I need you." We kept the listening, the real listening, the kind that does not rush to fix or explain or defend. the kind that just stays. I am teaching English at the community center again. 3 days a week. My students are immigrants. They sit in the same chairs I sat in 15 years ago. They have the same fear in their eyes. The fear that they will never belong. The fear that they will never be enough. I tell them, you are enough. I tell them, you do not have to be perfect to be understood. I tell them, find someone who sees you. And when you find them, stay. Choose them. Every day. Because belonging is not something you earn. It is something you build. One word at a time. One choice at a time. One moment of staying when everything in you wants to run. David is calling me from the porch. He says the sunset is beautiful tonight. I walk out and sit beside him. The sky is orange and pink and purple, the kind of sunset that makes you remember that you are small and the world is large and somehow, impossibly, you get to be here for it.
He puts his arm around me.
I lean into his shoulder. He says, what are you thinking about? I say, the waiting room. He says, that was a long time ago. I say, it was yesterday. He says, it was 3 years. I say, I know. But I still remember what I learned there. He says, what did you learn? I say, that waiting is not empty. It is the space where you figure out what matters. He is quiet for a moment. Then he says, and what matters?
I look at the sky.
I look at our house behind us, the lights on in the kitchen where the kids are doing homework, the maple tree that drops too many leaves every fall. I look at David.
His face is older now.
Lines around his eyes. Gray in his hair. He is still the man who fixed the espresso machine. He is still the man who learned to make pho. He is still the man who came back. I say, this matters. You matter.
Us.
Here.
Now.
He squeezes my shoulder. He says, that is a good answer. I say, it is the only answer. The sun dips below the horizon. The sky turns from orange to purple to deep blue. The first stars come out. David points at one and says, that one is bright. I say, it is. He says, do you remember that first night at the coffee shop? I say, every detail.
He says, I knew then.
I say, knew what? He says, that you were the one. I was just too scared to say it. I say, I was scared too. He says, I know. That is why I waited. I say, you waited for me? He says, I waited until you were ready to be seen. I laugh. I say, you waited 3 years? He says, I would have waited longer. I lean into him and close my eyes. I am not in the waiting room anymore. I am on my porch, in my house, in my life, with my husband and my children, and the maple tree that drops too many leaves. I am here, and I am not going anywhere. That is what the waiting room taught me. Not to be grateful for the pain. Not to pretend that the hard years did not happen, but to know, with absolute certainty, that what matters is sitting right next to me. What matters is in the kitchen, doing homework. What matters is the sound of David's voice when he says my name. What matters is the choice to stay. Every day, one day at a time. That is the slowest, most beautiful lesson of all. And I am still learning it. I will be learning it for the rest of my life. So here is what I want you to take with you. The waiting room was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. The beginning of learning that love is not about grand gestures or perfect words or never making mistakes. It is about showing up. It is about sitting on the cold floor of a garage when you would rather walk away. It is about saying I see you when it is easier to say nothing. It is about choosing each other, not once, but every single day, even when the choice is hard. Especially when the choice is hard. If you are watching this and you feel stuck, if you are learning English and you feel like you will never get it right, if you are in a relationship that feels like it is falling apart, if you are waiting for something that might never come, I want you to know this. You are not alone. You are not invisible. And you are not running out of time. The waiting is not wasted. It is where you figure out what matters. It is where you learn to listen. It is where you discover that the language of the heart does not need perfect grammar.
It just needs you to stay.
I came to America with one suitcase and a heart full of fear. I learned English the hard way. I almost lost the man I love because I forgot how to see him. And I found my way back, not because I am special, because I refused to give up, because I chose to stay, because I learned that the most important words are not the complicated ones. They are the simple ones. I am here. I see you. I choose you. I love you. Now I want to ask you something. What are you waiting for? What is the thing you are afraid to say? What is the conversation you have been avoiding? What is the language you have been too scared to speak? You do not have to be perfect. You do not have to have all the answers. You just have to start. One word, one sentence, one moment of courage. That is how you build a life. That is how you build a love. That is how you learn to belong. If this story touched you, if you want more stories like this, stories that help you learn English while reminding you what matters, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And leave a comment. Tell me what you are waiting for. Tell me what you're learning. Tell me what matters to you.
Because this channel is not just about me.
It is about us. It is about all of us who are learning, struggling, loving, and choosing to stay.
EMI.
Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. And remember, the waiting room is not the end. It is where you figure out what matters. And what matters is you. What matters is now. What matters is the choice to stay. I will see you in the next story.